Graham Bell was born in Scotland on March 3, 1847. His mother was congenitally deaf, and he, like his grandfather and father, would devote years to the deaf. Graham Bell, who invented the telephone, was actually trying to eliminate the silence of the deaf. He didn't succeed, but with the phone gaining a new feature every day, he enabled people miles away from each other to hear each other. Graham Bell's mother was deaf from birth. His grandfather and father devoted years to the hearing impaired. His father in particular tried to develop ways to teach the deaf to speak even if they could not hear. When two of his brothers died of tuberculosis, his father emigrated to Canada for the health of his only remaining son. After his father's death, Graham Bell traveled to the United States in an effort to promote and spread his work. He settled first in Ontario and then in Boston. Here he worked for a while at a school that trained language teachers for the hearing impaired. He then founded his own school. Bell, whose fame spread in a short time, was invited to Oxford University as a guest teacher. In England, he read the book on the physiology of hearing by the German Hermann von Helmholtz. He concentrated on the idea that the sound of music could be transmitted through a wire. Meanwhile, other scientists were also working on these issues. In fact, Antonio Musi had made such a device years before him, but had not been able to patent it. Returning from England, Bell was appointed professor of human voice physiology at Boston University. He attempted to put his theoretical knowledge into practice with technical support and to make devices for the hearing impaired to enable them to hear. He began working with an electrical engineer named Thomas Watson. When he needed financial support to carry out his work, he was helped by lawyer Gardner Green Hubbard. In 1875, Bell and Watson discovered that sound traveled over a wire to another place. However, the sound was unintelligible. On February 14, 1876, Bell and Gray applied separately for a telephone patent. Bell was granted the patent he wanted on March 7, 1876. While Bell, who received patent 174.465, was continuing his experiments in the workshop, acid spilled on his pants from the battery he used to operate the telephone. He called Watson for help. "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." While Bell was calling his assistant for help, he unwittingly made the first telephone call on March 10, 1876. Watson heard Bell's voice over the telephone. This invention, which coincided with the 100th anniversary of the founding of the USA, won him many awards at the Centennial Exhibition. A year later, Bell married Mabel from the Hubbard family, from whom he received financial and moral support to carry out his scientific studies. His wife had been deaf since the age of 4. Bell felt a deep affection for Mabel, whom he met as a student and later married. Despite his growing fame, he never neglected either his wife or the hearing impaired. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "No matter where your wife goes, no matter how rich she becomes, you can be sure that she will always think of the hearing impaired and their problems." Most of his works, which are overshadowed today by his prominent inventions, were on the subject of hearing impairment. He managed to record the sounds that his deaf mother and wife could not hear. He spent the money he earned from the gramophone on the Alexander Graham Bell Institute for the Deaf, which still works for the deaf today. The French government awarded him an honorary prize and a cash prize for his service to humanity. He used the money to found the Volta Institute for the Deaf in Washington. In order to develop the first-hand phone, Bell tried to overcome technical problems and fought a legal battle against Gray, who sued him. The phone took 4 years to leave the workshop. In 1880, Tainer, who helped Bell, tested the device they called the radiophone. Standing on top of a school, Tainer called Bell, whom he could see from far away, "Mr. Bell, Mr. Bell, if you can hear me, please come to the window and wave your hat." When Bell waved his hat, the telephone began to crawl after its birth. 8 years later, the state of Connecticut became the first city with a telephone network. Until recent years, telephony was carried out through switchboards and clerks, just like in Turkey. After a while, the tradition of women working in switchboards instead of male clerks began. The first female switchboard clerk was Emma Nutt, who started working in Boston. Magnet telephone calls, which were the subject of laughter in some black and white films, became automated in 1899 with the contribution of a man named Almonby Stauger. Strangely enough, Stauger was not a telephonist but an undertaker. His competitor's wife worked for the telephone company. Those who called Stauger for funeral arrangements were connected to his wife. Stauger rolled up his sleeves to find a solution to this difficult situation and managed to build an automatic switchboard. The public dubbed the new telephone the girlless telephone. It was unlike today's telephones. It had 3 buttons representing ones, tens, and hundreds. The number to be connected could be obtained by pressing the buttons as many times as the value of the digit in the dialed number. Since the caller often lost track of how many times they pressed the button, it caused confusion. A solution was soon found. In a short time, telephone poles and cable lines covered the streets of New York like a spider web. A telephone pole on the streets, which became unwalkable, carried 50 crossboards holding the cables. The telephone began to enter daily life in different ways. In an advertisement given to newspapers published in those years, the telephone was introduced as follows: chat. Much more comfortable by word of mouth than by telephone. In 1915, Bell opened the first long intercity telephone line connecting New York to San Francisco. His assistant Watson was again in front of him. Despite all the years that had passed, Bell did not forget the first day. He said to Watson, "Watson, I want you. Come here." The telephone, which wanted to attract customers by taking advantage of the possibilities of the telephone, started to play the sound they received with the theatrophone line to their customers sitting in their lobbies. A fierce battle began between these homes and workplaces and hotels. Hotels connected to famous music, theater, opera, and concert halls spread. Although Graham Bell is remembered as the inventor of the telephone, he also had works that did not stand out. One of these was his management of National Geographic magazine, which the whole world watched with great interest. The telephonic probe he used for the first time to locate the bullets in the body of U.S. President Garfield, who was shot and seriously wounded 120 years ago, was used in Röntgen's development of diagnosis with X-rays. He realized projects for sea and air transportation. In 1893, a writer who wrote about the developments related to the telephone expressed his observation as follows: "Humanity will soon be able to see the artists and singers we can now hear." Graham Bell died on August 2, 1922, at the age of 75 due to complications from diabetes.